I am joining with you today, and to acknowledge that others are joining from other ancestral lands across Australia. I would like to pay my respect to all elders, both past and present. They are the first scientists, first artists, and first designers of Australia. And I think it's wonderful to acknowledge them as the traditional custodians of knowledge for this place as we move to share knowledge with one another this morning. So thank you all and welcome. Today, David Jones will be sharing key insights from his doctoral thesis, Foundations for Justice and Knowledge Work. David is currently the founder and research director at Just Knowledge Australia. His extensive employment history also includes being one of the early members of Second Road, where he played a crucial role in developing both its core story and its core heuristics. Now, David is a pleasure to talk to, and he is a true multidisciplinary thinker, not a compliment I would pay to everyone. He is equally at home in philosophy and in physics, and it was in the spirit of a multidisciplinary inquiry that he recently set out to compose an autoethnographic account of a normative pattern, which he calls a strange attractor, that underlies all of our outcome-focused conversations. So he's now going to speak to us this morning about key elements of his journey of discovery and his conclusion around this pattern. And I also know he's not only keen to take your questions at the conclusion, but also look to continue to collaborate with people on live projects because he continues to apply and refine his work. So without further ado, thank you, David. Over to you.
Thank you, Drew. Can somebody enable screen sharing for me?
Certainly can.
Well, hello to you all. This is quite delightful. Barb, despite the fact that Barb's screen says that she's in Empire Bay, we're actually both down in Melbourne at the moment. That's where I'm coming to you from the Dandenongs. Let's see if we can get this screen share working. You can confirm to me that that's so you're seeing a Quinn Chow cartoon at full scale? Lovely, right. So thank you all who are here because you're curious, and a special thanks to all those who are here as friends. Many of you got a place in the story, but I won't have time to do hat tips on this, shrieking through the whole thing. So straight into it. Why an autoethnography? Because I had the data, which is what that pile of papers means. My thesis was made possible by many such piles of paper because a childhood illness meant that I was heavily reliant on bits of paper for memory. The blessing was that that same problem meant that I was really good at patterning. And the bits of paper that I stockpiled across 30 years of thinking about this issue became my PhD. And this presentation is a bit of a walkthrough of the gallery of some of those relics. Don't try and read too much of the fine print. You'll be able to pause the recording later. So this should wake up. There it is. Yeah. So as Quinn said, Drew said, the title of the thesis is Foundations for Justice in Knowledge Work. And that's what set me on the path. There were two deep tributaries in my life. And the first one was this search for justice in knowledge work. Most of my early career was as a quality professional, which from my point of view is one of the first forms of knowledge work that there was really clear, because you had a production line over there with physical production and forklifts. And over here, you had a guy who never did anything on the production line. He just measured stuff. And for the forklift guys and the production guys, getting a crushed limb was obviously an unjust thing. But I regularly had my head done in by people, particularly in the early days of quality, who treated everything other than getting stuff out the door as an externality. And so I began to wonder what justice meant in the world of knowledge workers like myself. And that became a sort of a theme, a question throughout my journey. As we move into the world of knowledge work, how are we to know whether or not it's unjust to accept a crushed heart or a done-in head as part of a job? The second great tributary was my long-term preoccupation with the distinctive in the traditions coming from Abraham, where God is a speaking God. This God's introduced to us in the opening pages of the old texts as one who, in my summary here, speaks, makes, and evaluates. This is the first 27 verses of the Genesis, where you get this repeated pattern of God saying something, it is, and he says it's good. And I think that's the high level summary of who the God is that's in this tradition is one who speaks, makes, and evaluates. The very next thing that text says is that he chooses to make humans in his image. And so I take it that a core part of human identity is this capacity to speak, make and evaluate, or make by speaking. And therefore, outcome-focused conversational interactions are fundamental to human identity. We make by speaking. So that was, they're the major tributaries. Now the work begins. And it relies a great deal on my earliest big project I did with Goldsby Smith Associates in 1992, when I was writing the guide to the research and development of implantable defibrillators. These were 4-year projects in bleeding edge software, electrical, biomechanical engineering. And it involved working with challenges in requirements formation that made this dialogical, non-linear character of the progress, the research progress, very clear. And this is where the flying wedge first emerged as a way of capturing that reality. So at the same time as I was doing that, I was driving to Canberra routinely from Sydney. And I was watching new estates get carved out of the farmland, all the way from the very beginning when it was farmland through to where there was houses all over the place. And I saw this as a knowledge system coming to expression in very material forms as a fractal. It was self-similar at different scales. First of all, you had land shaping at the level of hillsides and gullies and all the rest of it. And then at the scale of the block, where they would carve a place for the drains and the slab and all the rest of it. You had water being installed, the major sewage and drainage ponds and basins and so forth. And then they would run drain pipes and mortar pipes and so forth on the property. You had electricity coming through and the major pylons coming down to substations and so forth. And then later you would install the fuse box and run the cables in a house. So the end of one of those systems was the possibility of the next. And then the reason that I was driving to Canberra was I was working with Tony and Carnegie Mellon on the tax law improvement project. And my work was to clarify the knowledge development pathway in order to respect the expertise of two distinct groups of knowledge workers. In contrast to the estate project and the defibrillator engineering works, this was a completely immaterial piece of knowledge work. It existed only in the documents that were written along the way. So now I had multiple encounters with very large knowledge creation processes. There were many others happening over those years. And this is where my strong manufacturing orientation kicked in. And I started to see these activities as knowledge development pathways. So my notorious KDP. So I was convinced there might be a recurring architecture underlying our knowledge development. And I had a petri dish. You've probably heard of Alexander Fleming's The Discovery of Penicillin. He goes on holiday, comes back, and there's a petri dish where some fungus is growing and it's inhibiting a bacteria. The flying wedge was my petri dish. And so now I had a capacity for holding conversations, as being able to, that level of reality, if you like, and to be able to map them and think about them. And so now I had to make sense of all the bits that I regarded as knowledge development pathways. So science, design, engineering, all have knowledge development pathways in terms of human conversational interactions. The conceptual challenge was to discern where those different knowledge development processes differed in name only, or where they overlapped, or where there was a unified overall journey. At its simplest, the cognitive task was to assemble a series 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 out of fragments such as 1, 2, 4, 2, 3, 6, or things that didn't quite match or whatever. I think I skipped a slide there because back to here. So yeah, that's where I was talking about the flying wedge being the pivotal part of being able to hold conversations. And that's where it originally turned in the PD manual. Sorry about that. I had some clues about where some of the major fault lines and bunches in this concept of an overall human knowledge development pathway. And for example, my degree in hermeneutics before I came to GSA meant that I knew that the preoccupations of hermeneutics were nothing like those of rhetoric. So in the one you're kind of interested in mindfulness, and the other one you're interested in intent. Arriving at and sustaining some of these distinctions were real struggles. These were not trivial things. They were tectonic plates, if you like. In the presence of working with Tony and Dick Buchanan and building a design firm, it was particularly hard to hold on to what on earth hermeneutics was really all about over against simply rhetorical structures, which seemed to map very well to design. Another great divide, or a great fault line that I was interested in, and I gathered up many instances, is one that you'll be familiar with, the exploring, exploiting, or adapting, executing. Massive fault line in Western cognition. And we saw this then, and you all still see it. Every time somebody wants to do a LinkedIn post about how they're seeking to sell you a better world, you'll always get a list of contrasts like this, and they usually fall either side of this fault line in terms of being very buildy kind of things, very executable things, and things that are slightly softer. So some of those major fault lines were quite easy, if you like. At the same time, I was working on those actual things. I was also trying to work on the idea of a trajectory. I mean, how on earth do humans carry and participate in socio-material trajectories, if you like? And so I chose a few features. These came from reading Ong and Ricoeur. And I explored how each of these would move from being the very embodied and soft, if you like, through to being the very abstracted or settled or distributed or tangible. So if you think of any given conversational interaction, every slice through that will be unique because different things will be on different parts of the continuum. But that doesn't change the idea of there being an upstream and a downstream, and the idea that there might be wisdom for how to act wherever you are. And I liked playing with things physically, so I put these cards on string and had 5 meters worth of strings and slid them up and down, and it was just one way of prototyping and playing with things. Eventually my patterning and my lived experience fueled my conviction that there were three splotches of talk. These were places where conversations are not linear, but they do converge, and they create distinctive habitats. They're the hermeneutical conversations, the rhetorical design kind of conversations, and the execution implementation conversations. And these corresponded broadly with asking and answering the question, what do we want? How can we get what we want? And how can we implement our solution? So long story short, it took me 20 years to reach this stage of development, where I could see and defend my observation that there were recurring ecosystems of conversational cognitions across a create terrain whenever humans coordinate for purposeful enterprise. We can distinguish three very different habitats, each with a distinctive ecosystem of actions and artifacts we use in those phases. That's not all there is to what I found. There's another two terrains. This is the create terrain. There's perform and monitor. But that's all I'll cover now. Take, for example, the simple analogy of a couple settling out to build their own home. They move through these distinctive conversation phases. The early scoping conversations with a dream that roam widely, and eventually settle on things that matter most. The conversations with what Harold Nelson called the form maker, the person who can translate their block of land, their image of the rooms they would inhabit and the materials they'd use into a single well-resolved entity for which materials can be planned and specified. And then the conversations of building, where time becomes a key player. And if those habitats get confused, we end up with the frustration of partners falling in love with building materials that are unsuited to their block or their locale, or with significant disruptions to the building schedule because they want to move a wall after the foundations have been poured and so forth. So that architecture turned out to be very robust and to be fractal. In other words, it recurred again and again inside itself. And a really simple example of that comes up in the shared language you have around probes, prototypes, and pilots from the design world. So here the fractality of what we would see as a prototype is a build experience in the generate habitat and so forth. So having seen the phases, once the habitats were clear, I could get a much better picture of the profound functions of the phase changes. These phase changes are vital socially, and they explain a lot of why this pattern is entrenched in social processes. The first phase change enables us to enlist others to our project. So when we understand what we want, we can, as I said, enlist others to our project. This is the place where parts produce wholes. This is the phase where complexity theory makes a lot of sense, because you can get something that comes out of bits of the world, if you like, and emerges into something whole. It provides a capacity for identity and community, and we can amplify our purpose. This is when we can recruit others to join us. The second phase change enables us to magnify our impact across time and space. If you have managed to condense the knowledge from a design process into a specification, then that can go anywhere in the world, be on anybody's internet, picked up anywhere and executed. And that enables us to amplify our return on our social and cognitive investment. And in this part of the phase, the wholes produce parts, and Aristotelian logic gives us an account of those dynamics. And this provides a capacity for replication. We can amplify our presence. So now I reached a big transition and a major recursion that I went back to my beginnings. I now had a characterization of conversational cognition, of our ability to make by speaking as a defensible system, a set of parts defined as or bounded as a whole. I went back to my roots because conversation is a special kind of system. It's dynamical. That is, we see it unfolding through time. That last image that I showed you, that is happening as a dynamic thing. You could use that picture as a diagnostic, but it doesn't explain the way the system unfolds dynamically. And that took me back to hermeneutics and to Gadamer. Gadamer says many strange and beautiful things about questions, and including this, that a question occurs to us that breaks through into the open and makes an answer possible. And I was convinced that the nature of a question was how we encountered new knowledge. And I often thought in terms of the metaphor of the Stargate, where the explorer, puts their hand in and reaches through and touches another reality, if you like. So the nature of knowledge development, of producing new social and material realities by talking together, is a process of question answering. Now, along the way, I had done a lot of learning about complexity and chaos theory. James Gleick published a book called Chaos in 1987, and in 1988, I did a night school course in creating fractals on some very ploddy computers. We had to come back next week to see the plots that our computers we'd left running. So I had slowly felt my way into the whole world of attractors and strange attractors and scale-free systems and emergence and nonlinearity and sensitivity to new initial conditions. And I was trying to constantly see my system in terms of a complex adaptive system. And so doing a lot of reading of Gadamer again, go back you thing, inside and alongside GSA had always been working with questions as vital knowledge production tools, and often working with their power to function as recursions. This is what I did with Comalco rolled products in 1991. In addition to reading Gadamer again, I was reading multiple works by Robin Collingwood, who's a British historian, who proposed that historical knowledge was built through what he called a question-answer logic and knowledge recursions. And so you could answer questions, why does Hadrian's Wall exist, through using question-answering processes. So my gestalt was to put together the conversation framework I'd identified and the nature of question answering while seeing it all as a dynamical system. And this led me to understand this whole dynamical system in terms of being an attractor, that a pattern that a system always tends toward, even when a single part of the system is not determined. So in the same way that the double pendulum traces out a bowl, the conversations we have in order to answer a question trace out a strange attractor. The strange part of strange attractor is when it's fractal, when it nests within itself, that has questions within the questions, all heading towards resolving the same outcome-focused interest. So in my mind, I'm feeling this, and I'm imagining that each dot is tracing our progress in a cooperative conversation. It'll stay in the phase space, but its path might be very different. The progress of a conversation may appear erratic, but it will converge. So this then becomes the underlying architecture, the dynamical architecture of what of how we make something, how we construct knowledge. There's a pre-question phase, which starts when we align around a want. The question is when we clarify and agree on that want. There's a post-question / pre-answer phase where we cooperate to find a way to deliver on the want. We clarify and agree on that, and then we set about delivering the system that will satisfy us. So this sequence that flows from the posing of a question provides a dynamical frame, the change through time momentum, the sort of the inexorable flow and energy of the question being put. This is no longer the normal system that we're accustomed to, where it kind of like traces things statically and it rotates on the spot with feedbacks and so forth. This has the capacity to carry a system that alters and unfolds through time. So that this idea then that we can have a scale-free attractor mechanism that underlies all of our outcome-focused conversations provides a deep simplicity that can be applied to all knowledge development processes. If you look at a lung, a pathologist can discern 7 different types of bronchioles. You can imagine going all the way from the very what's it? Oh, cartilaginous, the word's right there. Trachea, all the way down to the capillaries, which are blood transferring. The pathologist can see the same fractal structure, the self-similar structure, nevertheless unfolding in different levels. And that's what scale-free theories point to, is this deep simplicity where you can have the same causes operating at multiple levels and the same dynamic explaining what's happening at multiple levels. And so what I've done, I've now characterized 12 levels of conversational interaction that are all functioning pretty much simultaneously whenever right now, these levels are all functioning, slightly distorted by the fact that this is a presentation, but all these levels are functioning right now in our conversation. And I've characterized those. There's more, but they become less easy to see. So what, or what next? There's a lot of things that I'm interested in and the implications of this. And the main one is this really transforms questions of organizational design. If most organization designs have that telling word crazy on the end, humanocracy, holocracy, bureaucracy, because they are abstracted impositions, if you like, very often coming from like holons and dodecahedrons and networks. They're coming from mathematical or spatial abstractions. The idea that there is an underlying pattern to the way humans interact to get work done provides you with an entirely different premise for how you would organize, particularly how you would self-organize. And so that's the area that I've been particularly interested in developing, and I call it humanemics. Emic is a word that comes from ethnography. It means that it's native to the people, if you like. It's in the tribe. Etic means it's an external observation. So an academic's observation about the tribe would be etic. So this is a humanemic approach. There are many, very many application arenas that are possible. I just noticed NSA. Security, if you're eavesdropping and you want to know how close a person is to action, you have a capacity to discern from the nature of their conversational interactions what phase of activity they're up to, if you like. There are just many application contexts. And that's about all I have to say today. I will put this, I'll put this thing in the chat. Back to you, Mr. Harrison or Mr. Thompson.
Oh, well, thank you, David. Obviously, taking any and all questions. That was fantastic. And having read your thesis, it's always impressive at the end to see someone distill their insights in the way that you have. So well done, because that is not a straightforward thing. But yeah, comments, questions from participants?
Can I offer a group hug? David, can we group hug you? This is like so crazy. All of this.
Thank you.
Screenshot. Okay.
Thank you.
And I have to say, David, that your office looks a lot like it did the last time I saw you. And when you and I shared.
Yeah, I haven't lost my dependency on stuff.
No, you have not.
I have a question.
Yeah, go for it.
David, I used to talk about, like, you'd have, and like, you can even see it in the way you gathered all these things. They felt always like, you used to use like the words like mud farts and stuff for all these different like ideas that felt really unstructured. And I wonder if now that you've created this framework, does the everyday experience of conversation feel different to you now than it did over the last however many years that we're talking about?
There are contexts where I think my awareness, I mean, one of the things that drove this was my awareness that so many of us, we carry this in ourselves. Why do we have the capacity to turn up in a meeting and get 5 minutes into us and think, this is not going to end well? You can tell when things haven't been framed well. And so I guess my capacity to see and diagnose and to offer alternatives has increased. Probably my patience with things. So, for example, you take that middle transition where you go from what do we want, and you're answering the question, how can we get it? Now, that the formal process for doing that, the one that probably all of us have done, is design. That's where you actually capture the intent from the want, and you translate that into something that is buildable. But that is not the only way you can make that transition. Serendipity will get you there as well. There'll be a whole lot less customer input, but it can get you there. I mean, you can be saying to your partner one day, I wish we had a way of stopping the road noise. And the reply is, yeah, but I don't want the wind there. I want the air to move. 2 days later, you're driving around the block and there's an angled fence with bamboo in the middle or something. Oh, there it is. That's what we'll have. Yeah, it's a matter of being able to see much more clearly the architectures of arguments, the relevance of approaches, the risks in and inappropriate things, and to consolidate knowledge. So to get, for example, in the scope space, we have very, very low proficiency. There's a massively growing urgency around that in terms of circle work that's learned from First Nations peoples and so forth. But being able to understand what, in fact, circle work from First Nations peoples brings, as in Tyson Yunkaporta's work, or how it's different or how it relates, what is unique, what's not, and so forth. It gives you a capacity to diagnose those things.
Hey, David, I got a question.
Yep.
You're talking before about it, conversation. It's a system that unfolds over time and it will converge. What causes it not to converge? Because I've seen a few just fire off in different directions, never to come back again.
Yeah, well, that's why it's not a deterministic system. It's an attractor, and things can go off, and they do, and they do that on a micro scale. The start up to every conversation, any conversation has kind of those rough starts, and there are moments where it can go in just about any direction. And often we actually invite that, sort of like at the beginning of a meeting or something, we sort of do this early scoping where we try and make sure we are all on the same page. The disruptions and dysfunctions, there's some that are really, really common pathologies. So there's a whole lot of ways you can understand why things would miscarry. Sometimes it's bastardry. And sometimes it's stupidity, but sometimes it is, we really, really do have a bunch of recurring pathologies, many of which are traceable to the industrial kind of materialist worldview that we've all been raised in. The whole action orientation, the low-hanging fruit desire, all of those sorts of things just sabotage those conversations so often. And some of the most miserable experiences we've all been in is when you do have a good conversation, and at the end of it, somebody says either, well, I'm going to go back and do some real work now, or they say, yes, so what's the action going to be, or something like that. And it completely aborts everything that's just happened.
I have a question, David. Oh, sorry, am I creating an echo? Okay. So, David, I mostly work outside organizational boundaries, I guess, where we're not working with single organizations. And it's really interesting that you're talking about the application of this to organizational design. I wasn't actually expecting that. And a lot of the context where you developed this stuff was inside organizations where there's a boundary of sorts. So I guess I'm just really interested how you think about this, where you're dealing with the pre-idea of even a group knowing what they want. Maybe they have a common problem. So I work in climate change, which is a big one. So I guess when I look at sort of the really big stuff where you're dealing with multiple organizations and entities and such a diverse range of stakeholders, how that plays out in this and how you think about the organizational design application to the organization of stuff that doesn't have boundaries or structural connections.
It goes back to the humanemic part of it. It just says that what I can reliably know that in the room, people are going to have either the same capacity and urges to understand the why first, so to speak, to get to an understanding of what we want and so forth, and to progress. With the scale of a problem, one of the things that happens, there's a phenomenon they call redshifting, which some of you might have heard from Einstein, so like the idea that light gets bent. So if you look at the design space, it gets redshifted and blue shifted. It goes down to the buildy side of flavour, or it goes up to the scopy kind of flavour. So most design done now around customer service stuff and so forth, customer service mapping is all very blue shifted. It's very, very close to build. It's got a lot of paint by number elements. It's very, but if you look and where hypothesis formation takes place is way downstream. In the kind of work that Second Road did, it was slightly more redshifted, and so you actually, your genuine insights come often in the upstream phases of exploration, not in the downstream phases of mapping. So that the whole system can shift like that. Now take that to your question space, and in the scope space where people are coming together, there's the same sort of shifting happens. Where you get a really blue shifted, if you like, scope, people are coming together and bringing their diversity, bringing their multivocality in the service of getting a shared want. But if you go sufficiently upstream in major problems like climate change, you actually will never get a shared want. What you will get is people cooperating, but with very, very diverse agendas and motivations. But they are nevertheless, in some sense, coming together around addressing, a massive system. So you get to be able to distinguish between the kumbaya versions of scope, where the ideal is that this makes us happy to get together and come together about something, and versions of scope where you actually have to respect the diversity from the outset and maintain it, or never expect to move it.
David, if I can ask a question, first a comment. I find it slightly troubling that I'm feeling so comfortable with a group of people who use heuristic in a sentence and know what it means. So that's my first point. So I'm sure we all feel a bit like that sometimes. Secondly, I have the great joy of doing work with Julian and Tim, and we often talk to people about the flying wedge. We call it the flying wedgie, to just be a fraction disrespectful. And but the model that you haven't talked about is the design curve. And I'm wondering how you see the design curve fitting into your, like I see how I think it fits, but I wonder, I just thought I'd ask you for some reflections on that, if that's okay.
That's fine, yeah. Well, the design curve was actually key for me in this whole journey, because when I encountered design, I actually initiated the curve. It came from a core metaphor for me of Big Bertha, which was a gun that used to be able to fire a 200 kilogram shell 72 kilometers into Paris. So this idea of a massive trajectory that's sustained, and it was that visceral thing of a trajectory. That's what design follows. People try, but what I encountered was people were trying to describe design as a process. And I'm saying, rubbish. It's this trajectory you can hold in yourself, and then you choose what you use on the trajectory. People looking from outside then see a process, but that's not what was done. So that whole idea of a trajectory having phases that it goes through in order for it to be productive. So to do exploration and then to understand more greater clarity around the intent, and then to hypothesize, and then so that sense of a.
So I'm almost imagining around the edge of the trajectory, the wedges, as you're talking.
Absolutely, each one constitutes another conversational space. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. That's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you for the curve. We love it.
Thank you. Yeah, but it really was a foundational. It was partly my believing and sensing that and seeing that play out that let me believe that the bigger one would exist.
Yeah.
David, another quick question, just kind of following on that one. You've got these three distinct conversation spaces. Firstly, incredible work. Love it, and really want to dive into these slides a lot further. So the three conversation spaces. I mean, there's a client that I'm working with at the moment that every single person, so we've got a group of probably 30 people involved in a project. I think if you ask them where we were, different people would think that they're at these different, each of the three different levels, yet we're trying to kind of pull them back into the first. Have you got any thoughts around framing that and getting people back into the first wedge?
Is Tom Key still with us? Tom knows stuff about that. He actually introduces to difficult government public service clients who have no idea where they are, and he'll just say, we've got to be in the same conversation. And that's not the one we're having. And so he introduces them to the idea of needing to have this conversation first, without which the other ones will remain dysfunctional, disordered, unintegrated, and so forth.
Yeah, I've found Tom has a unique ability to understand immediately when a conversation's going to shit.
There you go, Tom. Another piece of praise for you.
That's right. That's when I leave the room.
It does. It goes with a massively good intuition about what constitutes it.
Yeah, often associated with a certain sense of despair.
Yes. I will say something about heuristics. This was another. There was a lot of underlaboring that needed to be done in this work. In other words, clearing the undergrowth before you could build something. One of the areas that bothered me a great deal was, what the heck was this? Is this an archetype? Is it a model? Is it what kind of thing in the literature is this kind of thing? And ultimately, I decided it wasn't there. It is what it is. It's a structure at the level of human interaction. But another piece of underlaboring was around this word heuristic, because as we know, particularly in psychological circles, it's been hijacked down to being petty little subroutines. And it wasn't the way we used it. But I also had real problems with Second Road's, what do you call it, that chart, periodic table of heuristics, because 80% of those weren't either. We were really good at what we called, what I call nifty visuals. In other words, you could be facilitating and you could pause for 30 seconds or 2 minutes and do a nifty visual, and people would understand what you were doing. But nifty visuals are not heuristics. And one of the things that I did with this was to actually understand the nature of those few heuristics in the Second Road world and GSA that we worked up that were really heuristics. In other words, they conveyed a visceral trajectory to us, such as the wave, such as the flying wedge, such as the ABCD framework. These gave you places, if you like. And it's actually, if you look in terms of cognitive metaphor theory, it says that metaphors are not pretty things you use to illustrate stuff. They are the structures of the way we think. And the heuristics that we use, such as the wave, are a particular form of cognitive metaphor that has no verbals. It is an architectural. So whereas most metaphors are borrowed from the world, we've got, happy and sad, up and down, all of those kinds of things that are talked about by Lakoff and Johnson. They're verbally conveyed, if you like, by verbal images. These heuristics are spatially and architecturally conveyed. So I call them morphors. They hold a shape and a space. And those were the really distinctive heuristic frames that made a difference in Second Road. They were not just the general array of metaphors, and they were not the general array of nifty visuals.
Cool, thank you. I think we have time for maybe one more question, and then we'll need to unfortunately wrap. I'm sure we could keep conversing for a very long time.
I'm really, really happy to enter into conversations with anybody. Feel free to contact me. Any of these areas that intrigue you or interest you. If I get a flood of people on any particular theme, then I'm really happy to regroup and share. This stuff is not under lock and key. I don't have a Creative Commons license, but it's very much very much looking for ways on earth to get it, how on earth to get it into functioning in the world, because I really think it is pretty fundamental and helpful. So there, one more question.
I got a question, David.
Hey, Tony.
Hello. The way that to which you have talked about being practical, the way that we think with things.
Yes.
I'm working at the moment in a context where we need to think with software, as in you can't quite name it until you have expressed it, even in a like in one of those sort of prototype sort of ways. How does the thinking, but that could work with building or manufacturing as well? How do the things fit into the conversation framework?
Yeah, if you go, I showed a visual earlier, which where I had the original flying wedge from the R&D manual, and my version of it, which shows the top axis as the interactional, conversational, the dialogical elements, and the bottom axis is the material. And it's in the conversation that you get the socio-material production of those two axes. So the bottom axis is where all of those thinking with things take place. And thinking with things can be as big as I'm sitting in a house that is enabling my thinking with things at the moment, because I'm presuming that the walls will stay up and the electricity will flow and all sorts of things. But that fits on fits on the axis of translating as we go about our socio-material productions.
Lots of those things get thrown out way along. Lots of those things are really ephemeral and not part of kind of like a constant progress towards an outcome. That's okay. That's part of the fractal nature of it, is it?
Yes.
Is it some things that just sort of like help me to think for a little bit and then I'll put it aside for something else?
Yeah, certainly we can understand that, and it gives us room to be patient with ourselves or with others as we realise they are entering some sort of meaning-making subroutine or a prototyping subroutine, or whatever it is that's necessary in order to progress that fractal piece of the conversation. We do that routinely, that we do these little meaning-making bubbles that, for beneath the trajectory, and then we return to the main trajectory. So yeah, more to be said about the software part, because it obviously does some really interesting things to the way, and that's where why agile emerged and can exist as a genre, is because you are making in a digital space. That's a really weird thing to do conversationally.
Good, thanks.
And I think we're basically at time. So I just want to say on behalf of everyone, David, congratulations once again for completing the doctorate. It's a massive achievement. Also, thank you for being so generous, sharing this presentation with us, answering our questions. And in the spirit of this meeting and the chat, obviously, we will look to have more of these conversations. So thank you to everyone. Thank you to David, and hope everyone has a great day.
Fabulous to see you all. Thank you so much.
Congratulations, David.
And Lisa's little person.
Oh my goodness. Congratulations, Lisa. Lisa just stole the show.
Oh my God, this is
We
so
got totally
good.
distracted, Drew. We were not listening to you at all. Like,
Is that some kind of
That's
physical?
fine. The
As a
formal
baby.
proceeding is over, so babies should be front and center at this point.
He wants to see everyone
Much
Oh,
better
wow.
looking, much smarter.
Look out for somebody to see the hundreds of screenshots that I took during this thing.
Fantastic. David, thank you so much. It's
Thank you,
fantastic.
David. That was awesome. And thank you,
you.
everyone.
Lovely
Thanks,
to see
David.
everybody.
So
Great
good.
seeing everybody.
Messed up my day in a really good way.
So good to see y'all. Oh my